Moses' death wasn't just the end of man's journey. It marked the end of an era. 40 years of wandering, miracles, rebellion, and divine conversations in the wilderness. But God's plan didn't die with Moses. In fact, the moment he took his last breath on Mount Nebo, a new season began. One full of speed, surprises, and divine instructions. This is the story of what happened. God immediately spoke to Joshua. Moses, the prophet, the deliverer, the one who split seas and climbed Sinai, was gone. There were no trumpets, no towering monuments, no eulogies echoing through the desert winds. Just silence. The kind of silence that hangs over people unsure of what comes next. The Israelites had known leadership through a voice that spoke with God, a staff that turned rivers to blood, hands that brought bread from heaven. And now, that voice was silent. That staff rested still. But God wasn't finished speaking. In that sacred silence, something holy stirred. Heaven didn't wait. God didn't gather a council. There was no discussion, no delay. Scripture tells us that as soon as Moses died, the Lord turned to Joshua, not to the high priests, not to the elders, not to Aaron's sons. God bypassed all protocol and spoke directly to a servant. Joshua 1 verses 1 to 2. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now get up. The baton didn't fall. It was placed intentionally and divinely into Joshua's hands. God's words weren't wrapped in comfort. There was no pause for mourning, no gentle reminders of the past. Just a charge, arise, go. There is something terrifying and holy about a God who moves forward when we still want to grieve. But God knew something the people didn't. Destiny doesn't wait for funerals. It moves with the willing, and Joshua was willing. To the outsider, it looked sudden, a servant becoming the leader of a nation overnight. But heaven had been preparing Joshua for decades. He was there at Sinai when thunder touched the mountain. He guarded the tent of meeting when others slept. He was one of the few who brought back a report of faith from the promised land. While others feared giants, Joshua saw promise. God wasn't picking at random. He was unveiling what had been hidden in plain sight. Imagine the weight, stepping into the sandals of Moses, the man who faced Pharaoh and lived to tell it, who stood between the wrath of God and a rebellious people. And now, without fanfare, without ceremony, Joshua stands alone, with the weight of a nation pressing on his shoulders. What gave him courage wasn't confidence in himself. It was confidence in the one who spoke. God's voice wasn't vague. He didn't whisper riddles or deliver metaphors. His command was clear: take the people, cross the Jordan, claim the land I've given you. It was a call to motion, to inheritance, to war and worship all at once. But most importantly, it was a call to obedience. God didn't say if you're ready. He said go. Sometimes, divine timing doesn't wait for human comfort. This was a spiritual succession, not a political one. Joshua wasn't elected. He was chosen, not by a committee, but by a covenant. When Moses laid hands on Joshua before his death, it wasn't a blessing. It was a transfer of divine authority. Now, that authority would be tested not just by enemies, but by fear, hesitation, and the enormous shadow of a predecessor whose miracles still echoed through the sand. Deuteronomy 34 verse 9. Now, Joshua son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. There's a sacred rhythm to God's leadership. He prepares privately before he announces publicly. Joshua had been prepared in silence, in faithfulness, in service. The world didn't see his training, but God did. And when the moment came, God didn't ask the crowd. He chose the quiet one who had already been saying yes behind the scenes. Many of us wait for a sign to prove we're ready, but heaven often promotes based on preparation, not perfection. God didn't tell Joshua to rehearse a speech or rally the people. He told him to move. The call didn't come with applause. It came with an assignment. And Joshua's response? He obeyed. Leadership in the kingdom of God isn't about popularity. It's about alignment. Joshua wasn't the most charismatic. He wasn't born into power, but he was aligned with God's heart, God's voice, and God's promise. That alignment gave him authority that titles never could. The people didn't know what came next. There was no map, no strategy guide, just a new leader and a divine command. And yet, in that terrifying unknown, God made one thing absolutely clear: I will be with you. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. That was the only promise Joshua needed. Not maps, not armies, just presence. It wasn't the voice of the people that confirmed Joshua's calling. It was the voice of God. That matters, because sometimes people won't see what God sees in you. Sometimes even you won't. But when heaven speaks, the earth must align. One voice from above can outweigh 1,000 doubts within. This is how divine transitions work. God doesn't stop moving because we're grieving. He doesn't pause eternity for our uncertainty. When Moses died, heaven didn't blink. It moved. Because God's promises are not tied to personalities. They are tied to purpose. And purpose will always find a willing vessel. Joshua didn't have the pedigree of Moses. He didn't call plagues down from heaven. He didn't split seas with a staff. He had no tablets etched by God's own hand. But what he had was enough. Faith, obedience, and proximity to the presence of God. Sometimes, God uses the ordinary to do the extraordinary. Because his power doesn't require theatrics, it requires trust. That moment, when God spoke to Joshua, became the hinge between history and destiny. It was more than a conversation. It was a transfer of momentum. The wilderness journey, the complaints, the manna, the wandering, all of it had led to this intersection. Moses represented deliverance. Joshua represented conquest. The story was evolving. Joshua had walked with Moses, but now he would walk with God in a new way. No longer the assistant in the tent. He was the commander in the field. And yet, that field was filled with unknowns. Jericho loomed. Armies waited. But Joshua understood. If God starts something, he finishes it. And if he calls you, he equips you. Even in the silence between miracles. We often forget that obedience rarely feels glamorous. There were no drums playing when Joshua said yes. No cheating crowds. Just the echo of God's command and the weight of trust. It's easy to say yes when the path is clear, but faith begins when God says go, and you don't see the bridge, only water. That's why this moment was so sacred. God's call to Joshua wasn't just about a new land. It was about a new kind of leadership, one where the strategy was surrender and the strength came from stillness. Joshua's greatest weapon wasn't sword. It was obedience. And obedience opens doors that talent cannot. In today's world, we often chase influence. We want the platform before the preparation. But Joshua's story reminds us, the most powerful leaders are those who've spent time in the shadows. Those who've been faithful when no one was watching. Because God doesn't promote based on fame. He promotes based on faithfulness. Joshua had no coronation, no golden crown, just a word. And that word was enough. Because when God speaks, reality changes. One sentence from heaven can rewrite decades of doubt. One divine command can split rivers, collapse walls, and reframe everything you thought you knew. And that command had been spoken over Joshua. The story of Joshua's rise isn't just about leadership. It's about transition, about trusting God when the familiar is gone. Moses represented everything they'd known, but God was doing something new, and he needed someone who could move forward without needing all the answers. That's what made Joshua ready. He was willing to walk without a roadmap, because he trusted the voice that guided his steps. We all face Jordan River moments, times where God calls us to rise, to cross, to claim, and we feel anything but ready. But readiness isn't a feeling, it's a decision. Joshua chose to respond not out of strength, but out of surrender. That's what set him apart. That's what heaven honored. And that's what changed everything. And so, without fame, without applause, without certainty, Joshua stood. He stood in the gap between generations. He stood where Moses left off. He stood with trembling hands and burning purpose. Because sometimes, that's all God needs. A willing heart, an obedient spirit, and a man who will answer when heaven says, "Now, get up." Ecclesiastes 3 verses 1. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. Joshua was given an impossible mission. Joshua stood with trembling resolve, staring across the Jordan River. Beyond it lay the promised land, the place of dreams and destiny. But this wasn't a blank map waiting to be filled. It was enemy territory, occupied, fortified, and fiercely defended. Cities with walls as tall as the heavens. armies of giants bred for war, lands flowing with both milk and danger. And God said, "Go." No military experience, no strategic playbook, just a divine assignment far bigger than Joshua's ability. This wasn't just a mission. It was a calling soaked in impossibility. And that's how God often works. He doesn't hand out easy assignments to the faithful. He hands out impossible ones. Because the measure of obedience isn't comfort, it's trust. And trust begins where human strength ends. God didn't offer Joshua a map of the land. He didn't list the weaknesses of Jericho's defenses. Instead, he made one statement. Every place the sole of your foot treads, I've already given you. Not will give you, not might give you, I've given you. The promise was past tense because in heaven's eyes, the battle was already won. Joshua 1 verses 3 to 5. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given you. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. To receive what God had already provided, Joshua needed to walk in it. That's the paradox of faith. You don't get the evidence before you move. You move before you see anything at all. It wasn't strategy that would secure victory. It was obedience. It was putting one foot in front of the other, trusting that the invisible God was paving the way. The assignment wasn't just physical. It was spiritual. This wasn't just about fighting earthly enemies. It was about overthrowing spiritual strongholds. Canaan was more than a land. It was a battleground between the promise of God and the fears of man. That's why God reminded Joshua, I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. That statement, I will be with you, was everything. God didn't promise that there would be no fear, no resistance, no pain. He promised presence. And presence is always more powerful than planning. Because the greatest strength in warfare isn't the sword. It's knowing heaven fights beside you. Joshua knew the stories. He had seen what happened when people tried to conquer things without God's backing. He remembered the failed attempt to storm Canaan after the people refused to enter decades ago. Thousands had died. Courage without calling leads to chaos. But courage with God? That's unstoppable. What made this mission impossible wasn't just the enemy. It was the memory. Joshua was leading the children of those who had failed. He carried the weight of their doubts, their delays, their disasters. And now, God was telling him to finish what had begun a generation earlier. But Joshua wasn't afraid of failure. He was afraid of disobedience. God wasn't asking Joshua to be Moses. He was asking him to be faithful. Every leader faces this moment, where comparison tries to speak louder than calling. But God doesn't need replicas. He needs originals. Joshua's task wasn't to repeat miracles. It was to walk into new ones. Still, the pressure was enormous. Joshua wasn't just responsible for a mission. He was responsible for a nation. Every decision, every command, every step would affect millions. But God didn't burden him with perfection. He covered him with promise. Be strong and courageous. 3 times in the same chapter, God said it. Why? Because courage is rarely automatic. It must be chosen. Courage in God's economy isn't the absence of fear. It's the refusal to obey it. Joshua would face fortified cities, trained warriors, and unpredictable outcomes. But fear could not be the lens through which he led. God had spoken. That was enough. And when God speaks, fear must bow. God's command came with a blueprint, but not of tactics. It was a spiritual blueprint. Meditate on my word day and night. Don't turn from it to the left or the right. God wasn't handing Joshua a swordplay manual. He was handing him a scroll. Victory wouldn't begin in battle. It would begin in devotion. The battlefield of the mind would be Joshua's first war zone. Before confronting giants, he had to silence doubt. Before commanding armies, he had to command his own thoughts. That's why God emphasized meditation. Because in every impossible mission, internal battles must be won before external ones. God was shifting Joshua from survival to strategy. No more reacting. Now was time for leading. And to lead in God's name is to lead with divine insight, not impulse. That's why God told Joshua to stay close to the Word, because the Word would illuminate what sight could not. Romans 4 verses 17. God who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did. Still, this calling came with weight. Joshua wasn't just inheriting territory. He was inheriting unfinished business, battles that Moses never fought, promises that were still pending. Joshua would complete what had been postponed. That's the burden of succession, finishing what others only started. But here's the hidden truth. God didn't need a warrior. He needed a worshiper, someone who would bow before battle, someone who understood that victory didn't begin with force, but with faith. Joshua's military leadership would be supernatural leadership, heaven-led, not sword-driven. This mission wasn't only to defeat nations, it was to awaken a people. The Israelites had been wanderers for 40 years. Their identities were shaped by sand and survival. But Joshua would teach them to become conquerors, not by violence, but by vision. God never said it would be easy. He only said he would be present. And that's all Joshua needed. When the walls of Jericho would later tremble at praise, when the sun would later stand still in the sky, Joshua would remember this moment, the impossible command that led to unshakable faith. The mission wasn't just external, it was deeply internal. The real conquest would be within, overcoming the fear of being just a servant, silencing the voice that said, "You're not Moses," embracing the truth that God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. Joshua wasn't ready by earthly standards, but God doesn't wait for readiness. He waits for willingness. And willingness, in God's hands, is mightier than armies. That's the secret to all great callings. Not skill, not status, just one heart that says, "Yes, Lord." The promise still echoes today. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a declaration. Because when God speaks over your life, impossibility becomes irrelevant. When he calls, the path may look hard, but it's holy. And where holiness goes, victory always follows. Joshua 1 verse 9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. In the end, the impossible mission was never really about land. It was about legacy, about shaping a people who believed their God could do the unimaginable. Joshua was the beginning of a new blueprint for leadership, one that didn't wait for conditions to be perfect, one that dared to believe the promise more than the problem. So when God gave Joshua this mission, he wasn't setting him up to fail. He was setting him up to grow and to show the world that with God, no mission is truly impossible. It's just waiting for someone brave enough to answer the call. Zechariah 4 verses 6. Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. The people fully supported Joshua. Leadership transitions are rarely smooth, especially when you're following a legend. Joshua wasn't just stepping into anyone's shoes. He was stepping into the sandals of Moses, the man who parted seas, spoke with God face to face, and whose very shadow commanded reverence. Everyone knew Moses. Everyone followed Moses. And now, suddenly, Joshua stood at the helm of a nation still dusted with wilderness memories. You would expect resistance, grumbling, a few elders whispering, "He's not Moses," maybe even an uprising. But what happened next stunned even Joshua himself. The people, millions of them, responded in unity. "All that you command us, we will do. Wherever you send us, we will go." No hesitation, no rebellion, just radical obedience. Joshua 1 verses 16 to 18. This wasn't loyalty built on charisma or popularity. It wasn't the result of persuasive speeches or military campaigns. It was the fruit of divine timing and a shared hunger. These were the children of the wilderness. They had buried their parents, victims of doubt and delay, and they had sworn, never again. They had seen what disobedience cost. They had heard the cries of those swallowed by the earth. They had watched manna fall and fade. They knew what it meant to be stuck, and they were tired. Tired of wandering, tired of circles, tired of almost. This generation didn't want another wilderness tour. They wanted destiny. So when Joshua stood before them, he didn't have to earn their trust. He just had to walk in it. They weren't looking for perfection. They were looking for movement. The pain of delay had forged a generation that would rather follow flawed obedience than flawless hesitation. Their vow wasn't shallow. They added a chilling clause. Whoever rebels against your word will be put to death. This wasn't fanaticism. It was revelation. They had seen what happened when rebellion took root, when voices rose against Moses, when fear triumphed over faith. This time they were all in. Unity in the kingdom of God is never accidental. It is always forged, through loss, through fire, through shared memory. These people weren't blindly following Joshua. They were aligning with a divine movement. And when people align with God's direction, even the impossible becomes inevitable. 1 Corinthians 1 verses 10. We often chase platforms and pulpits, thinking that authority is earned through applause. But Joshua's authority came through assignment. Heaven had said his name, and the people responded, not to him, but to the God who chose him. Because true spiritual leadership always points beyond itself. Joshua didn't need to manipulate or campaign. He didn't bribe tribes or flatter elders. He just obeyed. And obedience always makes room for alignment. The people had no vote, but they had discernment. And in Joshua, they saw God's hand, steady, humble, undeniable. And so, a new chapter began, not with fanfare, but with unity, not with miracle, but with maturity. A generation rose up, not defined by wilderness wounds, but by promised land resolve. They didn't just want a leader, they wanted to enter. And Joshua was the one who would lead them through the door. The wilderness had taught them discipline. Hunger had taught them dependence. Delay had taught them discernment. And now, those lessons bore fruit in the form of surrendered hearts. God had prepared both a leader and a people, and both were finally in step. What would have torn the old generation apart only unified the new one. That's the power of pressure. It can either fracture or forge. And this time, it forged something unshakable. A people who were done dying in circles. A people finally ready to cross over. This wasn't about Joshua being perfect. It was about him being positioned. The people didn't need flawless leadership. They needed faithful direction. And Joshua, full of wisdom and spirit, was ready. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had said yes. As the camp stirred, as warriors sharpened blades and priests prepared the ark, there was no panic. No rebellion, just the rhythm of a people in motion. Heaven and earth were syncing. The page was turning, and all of Israel leaned into the wind of change with unwavering resolve. When God ordains a leader and a people say yes, history bends. The laws of nature can be paused. Rivers can stop. Walls can fall. Because obedience creates a current so strong, even gravity must yield. Joshua didn't command the people into loyalty. He walked with them in a promise. Their journey would be long. Battles awaited. Giants stirred in their fortresses. But something had shifted. Unity had cracked open a new realm of possibility. And Joshua knew, deep in his bones, this was not the same people who had turned back in fear. This was a generation of yes. It all began with one decision, Joshua rising and the people following. That's the secret of spiritual momentum. It doesn't require many, just one willing to lead and a people willing to follow. Heaven does the rest. So when the people pledged their lives to Joshua's command, they weren't just giving allegiance to a man. They were stepping into alignment with God's movement. And alignment always precedes advancement. Obedience opens inheritance. And that is the true miracle. Not that walls fell or rivers parted, but that hearts united. That's what God was after all along. A people who would obey not out of fear, but out of revelation. A generation who would say, we believe, we're ready, we will go. In the end, Joshua's greatest weapon wasn't his sword. It was the people who stood behind him. A generation shaped by loss, anchored by memory, and propelled by hope. And in their unity, heaven found its landing place. This was no longer just a journey. It was a movement. Hebrews 13 verses 17. The Jordan River miraculously split. The Jordan River was no gentle stream. During harvest, its banks overflowed with violent force, sweeping away anything that dared to cross. And yet, there it was, God's next command. Cross it. No boats. Nobody kiss. Just the word of a God who specializes in the impossible. It was déjà vu, but this time, Moses wasn't here to raise a staff. This time, it was Joshua's turn. For 40 years, the people had wandered, and now, their promise lay just across a furious river. This was no accident. God doesn't lead us to the edge of impossibility to mock us. He brings us to the brink to reveal what only He can do. The Jordan was not a barrier. It was a stage. But here's what most miss. God didn't split the river first. He gave the instruction first. The miracle wouldn't meet them in comfort. It would meet them in motion. When the soles of the priest's feet touch the water, the river will part. Obedience before outcome. Faith before sight. The Ark of the Covenant, God's tangible presence, was to lead the way. Not warriors, not scouts, priests. Because spiritual battles aren't won by might, but by reverence. The first feet into danger would be worshipful, not weaponized. Holiness would wait in first. Imagine the moment. The priests carry the ark toward the chaos. Thousands behind them hold their breath. The river roars like a beast. Every natural instinct says, turn back. But their spirits say, step forward. Because when you carry the presence of God, you don't fear the flood, you walk through it. Joshua 3 verses 13 to 17. And then it happened. As the priest's feet touched the water, the current halted upstream. It stood like a wall, a tower of defiance against nature itself. The water below drained away, leaving not mud, not puddles, but dry ground. The path appeared only after the step. It wasn't just about crossing. It was about confirmation. God was validating Joshua in front of everyone. Just as he had split the Red Sea for Moses, he now split the Jordan for Joshua. No more doubt. No more questions. This was God's chosen leader. Joshua 4 verses 14. Miracles confirm the messenger. That's why the river didn't part privately. It split in full view of every tribe, every skeptic, every wanderer. Because divine leadership doesn't need campaigning. It comes with confirmation. And this miracle left no room for doubt. But God wasn't done. He gave Joshua a second command. Take 12 stones from the riverbed. Build a memorial. Why? Because miracles are moments, but memory is legacy. God didn't want them to just walk through it. He wanted them to remember it. Hebrews 11 verses 6. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. Those stones would one day speak. When children asked, what do these mean? The answer would echo. This is where God made a way when there was no way. Testimonies turned into architecture. Faith became tangible. Miracles memorialized. The Israelites didn't just cross over. They crossed under the weight of glory. The priests remained in the center of the riverbed, holding the ark until the last person passed. They didn't rush. They stood steady. Because leadership often looks like waiting while others move forward. It's the weight of intercession. Can you imagine the sound? The roar of the halted waters. The silence of awe. The shuffle of thousands walking on ground that shouldn't exist. This wasn't just logistics. It was liturgy. Every step was an act of worship. Every footprint a declaration. Our God is still with us. This moment redefined the people. They were no longer fugitives from Egypt. No longer wanderers of the wilderness. Now, they were crossers of impossibility. They had walked through what should have killed them, and they did it together. Sometimes God doesn't remove the obstacle. He transforms it into an altar. The Jordan was once their barrier. Now it was their breakthrough. The very river that threatened to drown them became the place that defined them. But here's the catch. The river didn't stay parted forever. Once the people had crossed and the priest stepped out, the waters returned. The miracle was temporary, but its impact eternal. Because miracles are never meant to be monuments to ego, but reminders of grace. That's why God commanded them to build with stones, not stories. Because memories fade, but monuments speak. In times of doubt, they would look at those stones and remember, God made a way. God was with us. God can do it again. The crossing wasn't just about geography. It was about identity. Israel wasn't just stepping into a new land. They were stepping into who they truly were. Heirs, warriors, chosen ones. God had brought them out to bring them in, and the Jordan was the final test. Joshua's name would forever be tied to this moment. He didn't raise a staff. He didn't cry out for the waters to part. He simply obeyed, and the water listened. That's the mystery of anointed leadership. Creation recognizes the voice of the Creator in the vessel he sends. And though this miracle echoed the Red Sea, it was different. The Red Sea was about escape. The Jordan was about entrance. The sea closed the chapter of slavery. The river opened the scroll of destiny. One parted to deliver them from Egypt. The other parted to deliver them into purpose. So when the river closed behind them, it sealed the past. There was no going back, only forward. And sometimes that's what God does. He leads us into miracles not just to show us his power, but to cut off retreat, to burn the bridges that tie us to our fear. The Jordan didn't just open a way. It closed every excuse. Mark 16 verses 20. The Lord worked with them and confirmed his word by the signs that accompanied it. A divine warrior appeared. The dust of a Jordan had barely settled. The 12 stones stood like silent witnesses on the banks. The people buzzed with anticipation, their eyes fixed on Jericho's towering walls. But in the quiet between crossing and conquest, something unexpected happened. Joshua wandered alone, praying, preparing. And then he saw him, a man with a sword, not sheathed, drawn. Instinctively, Joshua reached for his weapon. "Are you for us or for our enemies?" he asked, heart pounding. The answer was thunderous in its stillness. "Neither. I come as the commander of the Lord's army." Joshua 5 verses 13 to 15. This was not a soldier. This was sovereignty embodied. Not here to take sides, but to take over. Joshua dropped his sword. This wasn't a moment for battle. It was a moment for worship. He fell face down, dust clinging to his forehead, heart exposed. Because when heaven shows up, your strength doesn't matter. Your posture does. "Take off your sandals," the commander said. "You're standing on holy ground." The language was familiar. Moses heard it at the burning bush. But now, it was Joshua's moment. His own sacred commissioning. Not before a crowd, but before a throne in disguise. Who was this figure? Not an angel. Angels do not accept worship. Not just a messenger. Scholars call it a theophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. God himself, sword in hand, stepping into time to lead his people into promise. Divine presence wrapped in warrior form. This wasn't about Jericho. This was about authority. Before Joshua fought one battle, heaven reminded him, "This isn't your war, it's mine." God wasn't just sending power. He was present in power, not a general above, but a commander beside. So many of us ask, "God, are you on my side?" But heaven replies, "The question is, are you on mine?" Because when God shows up, he doesn't come to validate our plans. He comes to invite us into his. That's the posture of victory. That night, something shifted in Joshua. He had been brave. He had been obedient. But now, he was broken in the best way. Not weak, reverent. Not fearful, aligned. He didn't walk away with new strategy. He walked away with a new understanding. Victory begins in worship. And this makes sense. Jericho wasn't going to fall by siege or sword. It would fall at the sound of praise. A strategy so illogical, only God could invent it. Marching, trumpets, silence, shouting. It wasn't about power. It was about presence. Before God brings down walls, he brings down pride. That's why the commander appeared. Not to give Joshua power, but to strip him of the illusion that he needed his own. It was a moment of holy recalibration, a divine reset. The message was clear. Jericho would not fall because of steel, but because of submission. The battle would be won, not by marching skill or tactical brilliance, but by yielding to a strange, divine rhythm. A rhythm where heaven's strategy rewrote earthly logic. The divine warrior didn't give Joshua orders on how to swing a sword. He taught him how to stand in awe, because reverence precedes revelation. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can carry into a battle is your own assumption. This moment, silent, sacred, strange, was the true beginning of the conquest. Before a trumpet blasted, before a wall cracked, before a shout was raised, God had already taken command. Victory was no longer pending. It had just been signed in spirit. Leadership isn't proven in how loudly you command. It's proven in how deeply you submit. Joshua's authority didn't increase after the encounter. It deepened. He wasn't just Israel's leader now. He was heaven's representative on earth. When Joshua returned to camp, his face bore the kind of stillness only found in those who have seen the face of God. He spoke few words, but in his silence, something radiated. Heaven had touched earth, and earth would never be the same. This encounter redefined battle. No longer was it about brute force. It was about divine order. God wasn't just with Israel. He was ahead of them. And when God leads the army, the only thing left to do is obey and watch walls fall. That's why the most powerful thing Joshua did wasn't fight. It was listen. He didn't argue. He didn't strategize. He bowed. He removed his sandals. He laid down his strength. And in doing so, he picked up heaven's favor. Jericho would soon be history. But this encounter would live forever in the soul of a leader and the story of a nation. Because every great breakthrough is born not in a war cry, but in a whisper from the commander of heaven. We often think divine encounters come with thunder, earthquakes, spectacle. But this one came with a sword and a sentence. I have come. No titles, no ceremony, just presence. And sometimes, presence is the most powerful strategy of all. So before Jericho could fall, Joshua had to fall. On his face, in worship, in surrender. And that's still true today. Before walls collapse, before strongholds break, before victories manifest, heaven calls us to posture, to holiness, to reverence. Because the battle is not ours. It never was. James 4 verses 7, submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. The manna stopped. For 40 years, they woke to miracles. Every morning, like dew on the ground, manna awaited, sweet, sustaining, supernatural. It was heaven's breadcrumb trail through the wilderness. No fields, no labor, just provision from the sky. But one morning, after crossing the Jordan, it was gone, just gone. Joshua 5 verses 12. There was no warning, no announcement, no footaway. The manna didn't fade, it ceased. Like a final note in a song that simply stops mid-melody. The same God who fed them without their effort had now called them into effort. And it felt like loss. But this wasn't punishment. It was promotion. The land they now stood in, the land of Canaan, was not a survival zone. It was an inheritance. An inheritance requires a different kind of faith. Not faith to receive miracles, but faith to cultivate promise. Manna was for a wandering people. Canaan was for a rooted people. God had not abandoned them. He had shifted. The provision didn't stop because he stopped loving. It stopped because it was time to grow. What once fell from the sky would now rise from their soil. It's a hard truth. Miracles often sustain us in seasons we're not meant to stay in. The wilderness was never the goal. The manna was never the destination. It was a bridge. But bridges are not homes. And now the bridge was gone because they had finally arrived. Still, the people were unsettled. They had come to depend on the daily miracle. Faith had become familiar. Now it had to become active. They would have to plow, plant, water, wait. No more instant provision. Just trust and toil. Holy, sweaty faith. Sometimes, the greatest shock is not when God says no, but when he says, now you till, now you sow, now you steward. Because the maturity of a promise isn't proven in what you receive. It's proven in what you grow. And yet, there was a beauty in the shift. A quiet dignity in the dirt. They were no longer surviving on heaven's handouts. They were participating in heaven's harvest. Canaan was not a land of dependency. It was a land of dominion. This was the moment Israel became a nation, not just a rescued people. The manna ceasing marked the end of childhood and the beginning of stewardship. They weren't just God's children anymore. They were God's partners. But even in the fields, God's fingerprint remained. The same God who rained food from heaven now taught them how to pull it from the earth. Provision hadn't stopped. It had simply changed form. Grace was now embedded in growth. This shift was not about lack. It was about layers. God was peeling back the next level of their faith. In the wilderness, they learned trust. In the promise, they would learn discipline. Manna taught them that God could provide. Canaan would teach them that they could produce with him. We often crave the miraculous because it makes us feel special. But God is not just in the manna, he's in the mundane. He hides his glory in ordinary seeds, in the silent work of waiting for a harvest. The divine is not absent in effort. It is revealed through it. And there's a truth in this. Manna was easy to receive, but impossible to pass down. It fell, fed, and faded. But grain? Grain could be replanted, shared, multiplied. Manna gave them food. Canaan would give them legacy. That's the nature of every divine transition. What feels like loss is often an invitation. God doesn't just feed us to keep us alive. He equips us to become alive, to grow, build, steward, dream. The absence of manna was not death. It was destiny. Philippians 4 verses 19. And my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory. Joshua understood. He didn't mourn the manna. He didn't demand signs. He led with confidence. Because a good leader doesn't ask for yesterday's miracles to continue. They prepare people for today's assignments. Joshua knew the promise was not in the food. It was in the future. And slowly, so did the people. They stopped scanning the ground each morning. They began walking with purpose instead of waiting. They put their hands in the earth and felt the weight of promise in the soil. Sweat began to mingle with faith, and the land responded. The manna stopped, but God didn't. He was still their provider, just in a new way. Sometimes provision looks like fire from heaven. Other times it looks like calloused hands and waiting seasons. Both are holy. Both are miraculous. We all face moments when the manna ends, when what once came easy suddenly requires faith and work. In those moments, we must remember, God isn't punishing you. He's inviting you to rise, to partner, to become the version of yourself that the miracle was preparing you for. And isn't that what the journey has always been about? God bringing his people not just to the edge of promise, but into the maturity to carry it. The manna fed them, but now they would feed nations. What stopped was not provision, it was dependency. So when the manna stopped, heaven wasn't closing its hand. It was extending it in a new direction. A hand still full, but now offering tools instead of tokens. A hand saying, "You've made it. Now let's build something together." And in that invitation, the silence of mourning became the sound of destiny. Hebrews 11 verses 1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. God ordered a mass circumcision before battle. Jericho loomed just ahead, fortified, ancient, immovable. Israel had momentum. They had crossed the Jordan on dry ground. Morale was high. Unity was strong. If there was ever a time to strike, it was now. But just as they approached their first battlefield, God gave a command that made no sense. Stop and circumcise every man. This wasn't spiritual poetry. This was literal. God told Joshua to use flint knives, stone blades, and circumcise the entire army. Not one or two, all of them, right before battle. It was a divine contradiction. Weaken the army before facing war. Joshua 5 verses 2 to 9. Genesis 17 verses 10 to 11. Circumcision was the sign of covenant, a mark of belonging. But this generation, the children of the wilderness, had never received it. Born between Egypt and Canaan, they carried promise, but not the proof. Before they could inherit the land, they had to bear the seal of identity. To us, this seems absurd. Why now? Why here? But to God, circumcision was not an interruption to battle. It was the battle. Before they could conquer nations, they had to conquer themselves. Before they could take ground, they had to surrender flesh. This was more than surgery. It was surrender, a willingness to be rendered vulnerable in the face of a visible enemy, because they feared disobedience more than death. They trusted that if God said pause, he would protect while they healed. Imagine the enemy watching. From Jericho's towers, the Canaanites likely expected an invasion. Instead, they saw smoke rising from still tents. No holdings, no swords, just silence. Because God was showing Israel and their enemies that consecration is stronger than conquest. God doesn't rush the holy. He doesn't prioritize timelines over transformation. And in that pause, in that pain, something powerful happened. The Israelites didn't just bear the mark of covenant on their bodies. They began to carry it in their hearts. We often want the promise without the process, the victory without the vulnerability. But in the kingdom of God, every great movement forward is preceded by a cutting away, a removal of the old, of ego, of comfort. Circumcision wasn't about punishment. It was about purification. Joshua obeyed without flinching. No negotiation, no delay. He knew what was at stake. Obedience doesn't always make sense, but it always makes history. This wasn't a military tactic. It was a covenant moment. And Joshua chose holiness over haste. And then, healing. Slowly, the men recovered, not just in flesh, but in faith. They rested not in their weapons, but in God's promise. And as their strength returned, so did their resolve. Now, they were not just sons of Abraham. They were heirs of covenant, warriors of belonging. It's in moments like this that God reclaims his people, not by spectacle, but by sanctification. He wasn't just preparing their bodies for battle. He was preparing their spirits for inheritance. Because possession without purity is dangerous. Before God gives you victory, he makes sure your heart can carry it. And then God spoke again, Today, I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. The shame, the memory of chains, the stench of slavery, it was gone. Not just in history, but in identity. They weren't survivors anymore. They were sons, heirs, kingdom carriers. Circumcision didn't make them more loved by God. It reminded them they already were. Every mark, every scar was proof that they belonged, not because of merit, but because of covenant. And in that belonging, they found boldness. Jericho waited, but Israel was no longer afraid, because now they weren't just unified, they were consecrated. They weren't just organized, they were anointed. The city could have 1,000 walls, but nothing could stop a people who had remembered who they were. This is the mystery of divine battle. The preparation doesn't always look like war. Sometimes it looks like worship. Sometimes it looks like rest. Sometimes it looks like allowing God to cut things away so he can make room for something greater. We often ask, why now? Why would God slow us down when we feel most ready to run? Because readiness in God's eyes isn't speed. It's surrender. The sharpness of your sword means little if your heart is still dull. Psalm 20 verses 7, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. The men healed, the people worshiped, and in that holy pause, strength was reborn. The kind of strength that doesn't just tear down walls, it tears down lies. Lies that say you're still a slave, that you're still broken, that God is done with you. Circumcision silenced those lies. From that day forward, the land was no longer just a promise. It was a reality. And Joshua didn't need another miracle to believe. He had seen the real power, not in parting waters, but in a people who said yes to God's strange, sacred way. And this is the secret. The circumcision before Jericho wasn't just about Israel. It's about us. Before every breakthrough, God still asks, will you let me cut away what doesn't belong? Will you trust me enough to be vulnerable? Because only the consecrated can carry conquest without being crushed by it. So yes, the command was shocking, but so was the obedience. And even more shocking, what happened next? The healing was complete. The hearts were ready. The silence was over. And now, the shout was coming. But before walls fell, God made sure his people stood holy. Zechariah 4 verses 6, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. In conclusion, God's plan never pauses. Moses was gone, but God was not. Joshua didn't have Moses' miracles, but he had God's favor. Each of these events proved a single truth. God's mission moves forward, no matter who is leading. When one season ends, another begins. When one voice is silenced, another rises. If you're facing change, loss, or uncertainty, remember this. God doesn't stop. He shifts. And when he shifts, he doesn't wait for permission. He prepares those who are willing.